Good evening, students. It's Sunday night. I want to tonight. I want to finish up chapter 20, looking at cases 13, 14, and 15, and then go through some concepts then in chapter 21. So let's look at case 13. In case 13, a person was injured by a product that he bought from Sears that he misused. And in the chapter, it talks about 3 defenses that are available to sellers of products. One of those defenses is misuse, which is what we have here. The second one is contributory negligence. That is yes, the defendant was negligent, but so was the plaintiff. And the plaintiff's negligence also contributed then to their injuries. And the third one they talk about is this idea of assumption of the risk. Think about when you go into a store and there's a sign there that says the floor is wet. And you go ahead and go into the store anyway. Well, when you are aware of danger and decide to ignore that danger and proceed anyway, that's called assumption of the risk. That is you knew it was dangerous, but yet you continued on in your conduct, and when you did that, you assumed the risk of any injury then that would result to you. Well, here this problem's based on this misuse, and because of this misuse of the product, then without a comparative negligence statute, that's going to be a complete bar then to our plaintiff being able to recover. What comparative negligence does is then tries to weigh to what degree was the plaintiff's own actions the cause of their injuries, and to what degree was the defendant's actions the cause of their injuries. And by weighing that, we can then do a judgment based on that weighting. So, for example, I have $100,000 in injuries. The defendant was 60% at fault, and therefore I don't get $100,000. I only get $60,000. That is 60% of the $100,000 then that is attributable then to the defendant's negligence. All right. I think that takes care of 13. Okay. Question or case number 14 is about a concept called the statute of limitations. It's not to be confused with the statute of frauds. The statute of limitations is a time period in which I must bring a lawsuit. If I wait longer than that time period, then I no longer have the ability to sue and get a recovery for my injuries. And this is on page 526 of your text if you want to go back and read. Page 526, statute of limitations. The statute of limitations under the UCC, as it talks about on page 526, is 4 years. This was a longer time period. This was 5 years, over almost 5.5 years. Therefore, exceeded the 4-year statute of limitations, and therefore that bars recovery. Okay. Case 15 is based on a concept left on page 525 and 526 this idea of industry-wide liability, in which I've used a product. I'm not sure whose actual product I've used, but if there's a limited number of providers of that product, I can sue under this idea of industry-wide liability and don't have to prove that that I purchased the product from a specific provider of that product. And that's what we have here. You'll notice if you read the text that it talks about how the particulars of when I can get recovery for industry-wide liability are beyond the scope of this text. But that's really what problem 15 is about this concept of industry-wide liability. All right, I think that takes care of chapter 20. I'm going to pause the video for just a minute, and then I'll start with just an overview then of chapter 21. Okay, students, this is chapter 21. I'm just going to kind of go through here. I'm going to start on page 547. Good faith, remember, and we've talked about this before. This idea of good faith is inherent in the entire context of the UCC. Means honesty in fact, as well as the observance of reasonable commercial standards of fair dealing in the trade. That's what good faith means. And when you've breached that obligation in good faith, you have liability. Course of dealing, remember that concept, and we've talked about this earlier. This idea that we're going to rely on how we've conducted business in the past, and if we've established a way of doing business in the past, whether it's by phone call or email or fax or Twitter account, however we do it, that course of dealing then controls how we then engage in conduct in the future. Usage of trade, and again, we've talked about this concept earlier, this idea that there are certain language and certain trade craft that's engaged in by people in different professions and sell different types of products, and that usage of trade is also going to control how we go about and do business and interpret the contracts engaged in that business. The example I use is a contract for Idaho number 1 potatoes. Well, an Idaho number 1 potatoes has a specific meaning for people that are in the business of buying and selling potatoes, and that would be usage of trade. Page 549, remember, modification of a UCC contract does not require new consideration, just requires good faith. Waiver, we've talked about waiver, that there's a provision in a contract and we ignore that provision, and because we've ignored that provision then no longer has any force and effect. Okay, page 550. Delivery. Seller has an obligation to deliver the goods. Basic duty of the buyer is to accept and pay for the goods if they conform to the contract. Conforming goods. Place of delivery is usually to the buyer's place of business, or if the buyer does not have a place of business, to their home. Seller has an obligation then to tender delivery of the goods, that is, make the goods available. On the bottom of page 550, inspection payment. Buyer has a right to inspect the goods before they're paid for, unless those goods are sent by COD. And what COD means is that cash on delivery, that is, and the post office used to do this a lot. I would purchase goods, but I don't have a credit card, and so I have the seller send them to me COD, which means when the mail person delivers the goods to me, in order for the mail person to deliver the goods to me, then I have to pay for them. And not only do I pay for them, but I pay a premium, maybe $20 or $25 then for the COD fee. But I cannot inspect the goods until after I paid for them. So usually, under the general rule without COD, I have a right to inspect the goods before I pay for them. But if it's sent COD, then I don't have a right to inspect them before I see them. But I can inspect them after I've paid for them, and then I can return them if they're non-conforming goods. Page 553. Acceptance of goods occurs when the buyer, after having reasonable opportunity to inspect, either indicates he will take them or fails to reject them. Okay, so that would be acceptance. On page 554, revocation of acceptance. So after I've accepted goods, after I've inspected goods and accepted them, I can revoke that acceptance, page 554, under either of these circumstances. Number one, the nonconformity substantially impairs the value of the goods, and the buyer accept them without knowledge of the nonconformity because of the difficulty of discovering the nonconformity, or the buyer accept the goods because of the buyer's assurances that it would cure the defect. Okay. A long time ago, I purchased a dog, and I was assured by the seller that this dog did not have heartworms. It turns out that this dog did have heartworms. And so I was able to revoke my prior acceptance because the nonconformity substantially impaired the value of the goods, and it was hard to discover that nonconformity. So revocation of a prior acceptance, and we have some cases in the back of the chapter that deal with that. On page 556. Okay, buyer's rights on improper delivery. If goods delivered by the buyer do not conform to the contract, the buyer has several options. He can reject all of the goods, accept all of them, or accept any commercial units and reject the rest. So, accept a pallet, but reject other pallets, for example. Rejection. If the buyer has a basis for rejecting the goods, the buyer may ask within a reasonable time. Must also give the seller notice of the rejection, and preferably in writing. Okay, needs to include all of the defects when you're indicating to the buyer why you're rejecting the goods. The seller, on the other hand, then has the right to cure, that is, to provide our buyer with conforming goods. And that right to cure then has to happen within the original time provided in the original contract. So if the contract is due on April 1st, and on March 15th I send non-conforming goods, I could still send conforming goods by the original due date of the contract. Well, all right. I'm gonna stop there. On Tuesday night, we'll start on page 559, buyer's duties after ejection. All right. I hope you all have a good, safe night. Uh, be safe. Um, stay out of harm's way. And I'll talk to you on Tuesday night.